in the middle of Campo dei Fiori, piazza in Rome, there stands a statue of a hooded monk. This monk is named Bruno Giordano, and on that very spot, 400 years ago, he was burned at the stake by the Catholic Church for spreading heresies. And one of the heresies he had can be summed up really in this comment that he makes. Take a look at it. God is infinite, so his universe must be too. Thus is the excellence of God magnified and the greatness of his kingdom made manifest. He is glorified not in one, but in countless suns, not in a single earth, a single world, but in 1,000,000, I say, in an infinity of worlds. That concept may not be foreign to us today, but 400 years ago it definitely was. And it was not something that the church could accept, that there were other worlds out there and maybe other life forms. Bruno Giordano supported that theory, that thought, and was burned at the stake for it. But one of the comments that will be pertinent to us is this one. It's actually quite a famous one that he made, but this comment that he made is actually one that will be valuable for us as we go through this series on the book of Revelation. If the first button of one's coat is wrongly buttoned, all the rest will be crooked. For us as Christians, I would actually flip that over and say if your bottom button, because normally we actually start from our bottom button, if that is put on wrong, well, then the rest of them will be out of place. And the reason I say that is because for many of us, what we don't realize is the way we view end times, the way we see how the end happens, influences the rest of the coat, influences the rest of who we are as Christians. We may not think that, but we don't realize how much it does actually impact us. You get the bottom one wrong, and then the rest are going to be out of place. And that will be your view on salvation, that'll be your view on redemption, the cross. All of that is highly influenced by how you view end times. I'm going to spend time in this session, our first session on the last book, rather than getting into the book itself, just kind of giving some background around what is going on, not just historically, but actually for us today in how we view the book and how we interpret it, and what outside influences impact us. But before I get into it, let's start with a terminology that will be used quite a bit throughout this whole series, and that is this word here, eschatology. Now that is basically what it means is it's the part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and of humankind. Eschatology is basically the theology of end times as well. And it's what will be said often. So if you hear that term now, you know hopefully what that means. The book itself has been challenging for many, many leaders and Christians. I mean, Martin Luther himself has said this about the book of Revelation. I can in no way detect that the Holy Spirit produced it, or that Christ is neither taught nor known in it. And it's not just the difficulty that people have had with this book. There's also the issues around how we interpret it. Here's a couple of comments from some modern day theologians and how the book of Revelation has been completely maybe taken out of context, misinterpreted, and how that's impacted us. M. Eugene Boring, an unfortunate name for someone who's a theologian, says this: no other part of the Bible has provided such a happy hunting ground for all sorts of bizarre and dangerous interpretations. Craig Coaster says, few writings in all of literature have been so obsessively read with such generally disastrous results as the book of Revelation. Its history of interpretation is largely a story of tragic misinterpretation resulting from a fundamental misapprehension of the work's literary form and purpose. And if you go online, you can find a lot out there that really is quite crazy. A couple of websites like lifeisatest.com, you can look at that. It's been updated with the coronavirus and how that is impacting end times. And there are people who are kind of turning to the war in Ukraine at the moment, and are using language, eschatology language, end times language to say this has been predicted by the Bible. But many aren't actually challenged with where they're getting that interpretation from and how they're seeing things, nor are they challenged when they get it wrong. There are some crazy things out there. I mean, even not just with end times, but also the imagery we see in the book of Revelation. I mean, 666 is all over the place, and it's interpreted in so many different ways that it feels to me that I don't think many of these people have actually read the book of Revelation to know what 666 actually means, because you can see that here in verse 18 of chapter 13 of Revelation. But what gets cut out is what follows from that number. Here it says, this calls for wisdom. Let the person who have insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That is the number 666. It's basically telling you it's just a man. And that's what the number 666. But we'll get into that later on when we arrive to that passage in the Bible and try to understand why people have blown it completely out of proportion and really kind of put this mysterious aura around this number, which actually was a number that provided support, comfort for those in ancient times, realizing that the beast is only a man. And no matter what they might do to you physically, they are not God. And yet here today we have this glorification of this number, which completely takes, the interpretation of it out of context. But like I said, we'll get this sorted as we come to it in the verse. So before we get into what's in the book of Revelation, let's just quickly talk a little bit about what's not in the book of Revelation. First off, there is no Antichrist. Yes, people want to try and put that into the book of Revelation, but actually it's not in that book. The word Antichrist itself is only used in 1 John and 2 John. There is a man of lawlessness, or a man of sin, that appears in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And there is also in Daniel the abomination that causes desolation. Now, do they all refer to the same person? Well, here's the problem. They don't really. They just don't match. Take a look at 1 John, for example, chapter 2, verse 18. Dear children, this is the last hour, and as you've heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour. They went out from us. They did not really belong to us. For if they belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going showed that none of them belonged to us. This passage is talking about not just one Antichrist, the Antichrist. He's talking about many Antichrists. And the interesting thing about it is he's not talking about someone from the outside. John is referring to someone who's come from within. And if we were to interpret that today, it would be for someone within the church who has become the Antichrist, or one of the many Antichrists. And the problem with trying to extrapolate out of 1 John and 2 John this figure of the Antichrist is really difficult, because John always seems to use the plural when it comes to this personal persons. It's not just one person, it's many people. And what it seems to be is that they're actually misleading people in their beliefs of Jesus. So that's the difficulty with 1 and 2 John. Going to the abomination that causes desolation in the book of Daniel, Jesus himself actually refers to this and prophesies. He talks about an event that's going to happen that involves this abomination that causes desolation. You can see it in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 to 16. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. One thing we need to understand about Matthew is that he is a Jew, and he is writing predominantly to a Jewish crowd. So he can refer to the book of Daniel in a way that Jews, with the assumption that Jews would understand what he's talking about. Luke, on the other hand, he's talking to predominantly a Gentile population who may not have read Daniel. And so when referring this story of Jesus talking about end times in this sense, he does it a little bit differently. In Luke 21, verses 20 to 23, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is a time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it would be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. Many would believe that this actual event has happened. Jesus is talking to his Jewish audience, and he's telling them this is what's going to happen. And in fact, we see it happening, as described by Josephus in AD 70. We see it as the fall of Jerusalem, and people fleeing into the mountains, abandoning the place. And interestingly enough, the person who started this war, the first Roman Jewish war, who led the first Roman armies, was a guy named Vespasian. Up until then, the emperor was Nero, and Nero had familial ties to Julius Caesar. So it was, in a sense, kind of Julius Caesar's family line leading up to Nero. But when Nero was committed suicide, when he died, Vespasian was called to be emperor, and for the first time, someone not within that house of Caesar was becoming the emperor. Vespasian was in the middle of this battle with the Jews in the countryside. He had laid siege to Jerusalem, and he then went back and became emperor. His son Titus remained to basically destroy Jerusalem, which he did. And personally, Titus walked into the Holy of Holies, bearing a torch, destroyed it from the inside, put up the Roman standards over the ruins of the temple, and exiled people out of Jerusalem, and they all fled into the hills. His brother later on, Titus himself, will succeed his father as emperor, and then his younger brother, Domitian, will then succeed from Titus. It's the first time a bloodline had, basically a proper family bloodline had followed from father to son, with Domitian being the key person in which the book of Revelation revolves a lot of the imagery around. Regarding the man of sin, or the man of lawlessness, it's important that we go to the verse in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Take a look. Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by the teaching allegedly from us, whether by prophecy or by word of mouth or by letter asserting that the day of the Lord has come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming. The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie, and all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. They perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie, and so that all will be condemned who have not believed the truth but have delighted in wickedness. It's a fascinating verse. It's a fascinating passage. And it's really the only time we hear of this one person who may be associated with, in a sense, an antichrist, but referred to by Paul as the man of lawlessness or the man of sin. Now, again, many theologians believe this has been fulfilled. In fact, early church fathers of the Reformation were quite intent on pointing out who this person was. Take a look at John Calvin. Though it be admitted that Rome was once the mother of all churches, yet from the time when it began to the seat of Antichrist, it has ceased to be what it was before. Some persons think us too severe and censor us when we call the Roman pontiff Antichrist. But those who are of the opinion do not consider that they bring the same charge of presumption against Paul himself, after whom we speak and whose language we adopt. I shall briefly show that Paul's words in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 are not capable of any other interpretation than that which applies them to the papacy. And that's John Calvin. But the interesting part of his theory around that, it's not just him, it's actually shared across all Reformed lines from people who are in different spaces and places around the world. They've all come to a very similar conclusion. Take a look at John Knox, the father of Presbyterianism. I no more doubt but that it is the synagogue of Satan, and the head thereof, called the Pope, to be the man of sin of whom the apostle speaks. But even more so, not just John Knox or John Calvin, another John Wesley. In many respects, the Pope has an indisputable claim to those titles. He is, in an emphatic sense, the man of sin, as he increases all manner of sin above measure. And he is, too, properly styled the son of perdition, as he has caused the death of numberless multitudes, both of his opposers and followers, destroyed innumerable souls, and will himself perish everlastingly. It's fascinating that church fathers over the centuries have had very strong views about who this man or this person is in this passage of Paul's in 1 Thessalonians. Interestingly enough, when it came to the Antichrist and who the early church believed, if we go right back to right when about after the book of Revelation was written, the early church fathers had a pretty clear idea about who the Bible is talking about when we talk about this man of lawlessness or this man of sin. Take a look at Irenaeus, who was born about 103 AD, literally 10 years after what we believe are the events of the book of Revelation. Look what he says. We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who had beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. And Irenaeus is actually quite funny here because almost trying to help people understand what he's talking about and not giving away the name, but at the same time giving the name away, which I find quite amusing. So what else is not in this book of Revelation? What's not in there is really our views of the rapture. Now, there are very differing views around what we mean by rapture. There is a traditional, almost orthodox sense of the term rapture, and we see it very much in this passage here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 15 to 17. It says, "Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you will not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command and with the voice of the archangel and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever." This is the Orthodox version, what the church has kind of revealed as the second coming of Jesus, in that the dead will rise and then we will rise with them. There is also other views of the rapture. Most have heard and have been kind of made famous through the books left behind. And really their verses come from something that Jesus says himself. Take a look at this in Matthew chapter 24, verses 37 to 40. It says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up until the day of Noah entered the ark. They knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. And this is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. Two women will be grinding a hand mill, one will be taken, one will be left. Now, setting aside the theological understandings of this passage in particular and what Jesus is trying to use and the imagery he's using, which would have been very typically Jewish, and our understanding of that passage, out of it has developed quite a theology. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. But what both of these passages are really talking about is the second coming of Jesus, and what we term in Greek, we use this word called parousia, the second coming of Jesus. Now, now comes the difficult part. Now we've got to put our thinking caps on, because there are differing views around not only about the second coming of Jesus and how that's going to work, but also how end times will come about. And a lot of it is based on how we interpret, in particular, the book of Revelation. Let's take a look at some of these views. The first one is preterism. And that is, a preterist is someone who interprets either partially or fully that the prophecies in the Bible have actually already happened. A preterist would think, for the most part, that all the prophecies that you read in Daniel or Ezekiel in particular and Revelation, they are things that have already happened. Now, there are what they call partial preterists who believe that for the most part, those prophecies have already occurred. Now, in all of these views, just a heads up, they all believe Jesus will return. There will be a second coming. There will be a parousia. They all believe it. They just believe it in different ways. And they believe also that there will be a judgment. So just keep that in mind as we go through these. So first we have preterism. Next we have what we call historicists or historicism, which is basically what we would call the orthodox view. And that is that the fulfillment of biblical prophecy has occurred throughout history and continues to occur. Now, in saying that, that means basically that not only do we believe that it may have happened in the past, but it could also happen in the future. And that could also mean multiple events happening. So, for example, if we talk about the Antichrist, historicists would believe that, yes, actually there was this person or this figure in the past that the early church referred to as the Antichrist, but that doesn't preclude there might be a future Antichrist that will do the same. Right? So all these events, all this abomination that's called desolation, yes, actually there's obvious links to AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem, but there may also be a future event. So that's what historicists believe. There are also other things, futurism. Futurism are the prophecies of Revelation, Ezekiel, and Daniel in particular. They are future events. They have not happened yet, and not just figuratively, but literal, physical, apocalyptical, and global. Futurists in particular are the ones that we will focus a little bit on, because they are highly influenced, in fact, most of them without even realizing it, by dispensationalism. That is a word that we will break down a little later on, because when it comes to end times, I don't think many of us really understand how much dispensationalism kind of weaves its way across denominations and all Christians. It's amazing. It's kind of like cancer. It's indiscriminate about your beliefs per se, and it will change your thinking and your way of doing things. It's not a positive thing in my mind, but we'll break that down a little bit as we get further into this. Lastly, we have idealism. And idealism is quite interesting. It does not see any of the prophecies as being fulfilled in a literal, physical, earthly sense, either in the past, present, or future. And an idealist, they are a minority, but they just see this as allegorical. They see these as stories. They don't see it as historical in any sense of way, nor do they see it as a future event. They don't see any of that. They just see it as a story that gives us a meaning or an understanding. And like I said, they're actually a minority amongst us.